Welcome to the deep dive. We're diving deep today. And it's into something pretty fundamental to the military, this concept of the kill chain. Basically, think of it as like understand, decide, and act, that basic action loop, but in, warfare. And to really get into this, we're mainly looking at Christian Brose's book, The Kill Chain, plus some other really relevant stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting how that term kill chain, it really took off during the information revolution back in the 80s, even though, those core steps, understanding, deciding, acting, they've always been a part of conflict.
Yeah,
But before, it was all often within like a single weapon system.
right, exactly. And Brose, he kicks off his book with this really powerful moment. It's a conversation he had back in 2017 with Senator John McCain. And McCain, he was deeply worried that the U.S. could lose a war with China, not in some distant future, but like right now. And his big concern is that the U.S. military's technological edge was eroding, and surprisingly, the public wasn't really aware of it.
Yeah, you could really feel McCain's urgency in the book. He's concerned that future generations will look back and ask, like, why didn't they do more when they had the chance?
Yeah.
It sets a pretty somber tone for the whole discussion, really.
Yeah, definitely. And remember how we talked about the information revolution and how it like fueled this idea of networked warfare? Well, back in the 90s, there was this huge buzz about a revolution in military affairs. The thought was that with all this new tech for gathering, processing, and sharing information, you could create this super connected battlefield with the kill chain as its heart, right? Like
Right.
digital communication, powerful computers, and linking all these different systems. It was revolutionary.
The initial idea was that this wouldn't just make existing military stuff better, but would totally change how wars were fought. It would be about faster, more integrated kill chains, not just throwing tons of conventional weapons at the problem.
But here's the thing. And this is where Brose's argument gets really interesting. He says that despite all the hype and the huge defense budgets in the 90s, the U.S. military didn't really change how it fought wars at a fundamental level. Think about the Gulf War. It was a clear victory. But even then, Andrew Marshall, he wrote a report saying the U.S. didn't fully use its potential to move critical information quickly. There were all these bureaucratic roadblocks, and this kind of created this false sense of security.
And you've got Admiral William Owens. He was saying, hey, maybe we learned the wrong lessons from the Gulf War. Maybe we got overconfident because we were up against a weaker opponent and we ended up validating old ways of doing things. He was worried that if we didn't adapt to the new threats out there, American military strength would actually decline.
And then, bam, 9/11 hits. Naturally, everything shifts to counterterrorism. This did lead to some amazing, super fast kill chains, especially within special operations forces, for taking down terrorist networks. But Brose argues that this focus on counterterrorism became this strategic detour, this kind of sidetrack in the Middle East. And it meant we took our eyes off the ball with China and Russia. They were the emerging threats, and we weren't paying enough attention.
Right, and this raises a big question. Even as the war in Iraq became this huge strategic mess, why didn't the U.S. rethink its whole defense strategy? Brose points out that a crazy amount of money, like over $59 billion just in the 2000s, was wasted on canceled weapons programs that produced absolutely nothing usable. It makes you wonder if anyone was held accountable for those failures, or if they just kept doing the same things over and over again.
It really makes you think, right? And here's where it gets even more worrying. Even with all these supposedly advanced information age systems, it turns out different parts of the US military have a really hard time sharing even basic information with each other. It's kind of crazy. Like, take the F-22 and the F-35. They're both fighter jets, made by the same company, used by the same branches of the military, but they can't directly share critical data because they don't have common standards. No one prioritized making sure they could talk to each other. Brose compares it to them speaking different languages like Greek and Latin. And this lack of basic interoperability, it created these huge vulnerabilities, which, as we saw with Russia and Ukraine, our potential enemies were totally ready to exploit.
The main problem was that the focus stayed on just making existing platforms a little bit better. Tanks, manned aircrafts, those big ships, satellites. They weren't putting enough effort into building these new integrated battle networks, and especially not into creating much faster kill chains. And this is exactly what Marshall warned about back in '92, that all those platforms would become sitting ducks in a future conflict.
Which brings us to the big wake-up calls, Russia and China. In February 2014, the world saw what Russia did in Ukraine with those little green men. But these weren't just some random militia. They had some serious hardware, electronic warfare systems, advanced air defenses, precision artillery, all working together in this super effective reconnaissance strike complex. Basically, it's this system that links sensors, command, and weapons to find and hit targets super fast. And they could close that kill chain with scary speed, which caught a lot of people in Washington totally off guard.
What was so shocking about Ukraine was that it showed how much Russia's military had modernized under Putin.
Mm.
They'd been studying how the U.S. fought in Kosovo and Iraq, and they built capabilities specifically to counter U.S. power in Europe. The speed and effectiveness of their reconnaissance strike complex, both in Ukraine and later in Syria, it really surprised Washington. They weren't expecting that level of sophistication.
Yeah, it was a real eye-opener. The Rand Corporation, they even predicted that Russia could reach those Baltic capitals in like 60 hours, which is insane. It showed how unprepared the U.S. military was for this kind of fast, high-tech warfare. Suddenly, you had generals openly saying they were outnumbered, outranged, and outgunned. But Brose argues this wasn't some sudden surprise attack. It was the result of years of Russian military modernization that Washington basically ignored.
Now, China, they learned a different but equally worrying lesson from the Gulf War. They saw how the U.S. military could just dismantle Iraq's ability to fight its kill chain with precise strikes, and that scared them. So they came up with a very deliberate strategy to neutralize those American advantages.
Right, and their strategy had a few parts to it. First, they started building a massive stockpile of missiles, specifically to target U.S. bases all over Asia, like Japan and Guam. The idea was to overwhelm defenses with just sheer numbers, a saturation attack. Then, they poured resources into developing advanced early warning radars, really good air and missile defenses, and powerful jamming tech to counter American strike aircraft. They basically wanted to make it so risky and expensive for the U.S. to operate in the region that we'd think twice before even trying.
But the most unsettling part of China's strategy, according to Brose, is their assassin's mace weapons. These are designed to take out the very systems the U.S. military depends on to fight effectively communication and intelligence satellites, especially GPS, critical information networks, and all those logistical supply chains. This systems destruction warfare, as he calls it, aims to basically paralyze the U.S. military so it can't coordinate or sustain a long fight. And this is especially worrying given how reliant the U.S. military has become on things like GPS and satellite communication.
So the big question is, why did the U.S. seem to miss all these growing threats from both Russia and China? Brose has a few ideas. After the Cold War, there was this widespread belief that great power competition was over, done, finished. Then, after 9/11, everyone understandably focused on transnational terrorism. And, maybe there was this naive hope that China and Russia would eventually become more like the U.S. politically and economically. And let's not forget the influence of all those American businesses that were making a ton of money in China. They definitely didn't want to rock the boat.
And all of this has led to a pretty noticeable decline in U.S. military dominance. Precision-guided weapons, which initially gave the U.S. a huge offensive edge, are now everywhere, especially in China's arsenal. This has flipped the advantage, making it much harder to attack, especially for a country like China operating in its own backyard.
Yeah, that's a good point. The U.S. military, which has always been built to project power and attack far from home, now faces opponents who have specifically invested in ways to counter that exact strength. This is why Brose talks about defense without dominance, a pretty major strategic shift the U.S. might have to make.
And a key part of adapting to this new reality is understanding the growing tech gap. Silicon Valley and the commercial tech sector in general are innovating at an insane speed, way faster than the military can keep up with. Brose makes this striking comparison. He says those graphics processing units made by companies like NVIDIA are hundreds of times more powerful than the main processors in even advanced military systems like the F-35.
It's mind-blowing, the difference. The information revolution, which at its core is about sensors, powerful computers, and interconnected networks, has seen incredible progress in the commercial world. We've got cheap, high-quality, tiny sensors everywhere: electro-optical, infrared, radar, lidar, acoustic, even synthetic aperture radar.
And the whole space game is changing too. Companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin are making space launches way cheaper and more frequent. This has led to a boom in these microsatellite constellations like Starlink, which could give us near-constant real-time surveillance and create an unbelievable amount of data.
And it doesn't stop there. The information revolution is also transforming biotech. We've got breakthroughs in genome sequencing and gene editing, which could have military applications in things like boosting human performance. It's wild.
And then there's the even more cutting-edge stuff, the quantum information technologies. We're talking about quantum sensors, quantum communications, quantum computers. This stuff has the potential to totally change warfare. And the crazy thing is, a lot of the investment in these areas is coming from private companies, not the government.
But here's the catch. Brose says Silicon Valley is increasingly hesitant to work with the Department of Defense. Part of it is economics, part of it is ideology. It's this tragic irony that the Pentagon is now realizing how much it depends on these commercially developed technologies, but for decades they've basically created obstacles to working together.
And Brose makes an interesting historical comparison. He contrasts President Eisenhower's successful leadership of the military-industrial complex during the early Cold War with what happened in the following decades. He says the U.S. procurement process became much slower and more risk-averse, almost like the less efficient Soviet model.
Which brings us to the big problem, bureaucratic inertia. Everyone agrees that great power competition is back and we need to innovate fast, but Washington seems stuck in this loop of saying the same things without actually changing anything. It's like the system itself is preventing progress.
And Brose lays out several specific roadblocks. The defense acquisition system, which is all about minimizing risk and accounting for every penny, is just too slow for the kind of rapid tech development we need now. He mentions General Schriever's letter from 1986, where he criticized how politicized and micromanaged the procurement process had become. It was a stark contrast to the more agile approach they had during the early Cold War. And things got even worse in the 90s when federal funding for defense research and development was cut, and there was a bigger focus on politically motivated earmarks instead of what the military actually needed.
And then you have the defense industry itself, which has become increasingly concentrated, making it harder for new, innovative companies to break in. There's this growing gap between the national security folks and the fast-moving tech world. And maybe the most worrying thing is this failure of imagination that happens when you've been the dominant military power for so long.
Budget cuts don't help either. They often force a choice between keeping old systems running and investing in new technologies, and guess which one usually wins? And then there's the infamous Tower of Babel problem, all the incompatible information systems within the U.S. military. It's a symptom of this deeper dysfunction.
The F-35 fighter jet, with its incredibly long and expensive development process, is a perfect example of this. By the time it was ready, a lot of the technology was already outdated. Brose explains how these long-term programs of record gain so much momentum and support that it's almost impossible to replace them, even with something better.
And as we talked about earlier, tight budgets often mean that future needs lose out to the immediate demands of keeping all those legacy systems running. Brose describes Russia's actions in Ukraine on February 27, 2014, as an ambush by the future. It exposed how vulnerable Washington was because it hadn't bothered to prepare for these emerging threats. They were caught flat-footed.
So what's the way forward? Brose argues that we need to completely rethink our approach to defense. Instead of just buying individual platforms, we need to focus on building integrated networks of kill chains. And the key is to buy outcomes, not just hardware. It's not about how many tanks or planes you have. It's about what they can actually do together.
And a big part of this new approach has to be embracing the idea of defense without dominance and recognizing that allies and partners are absolutely essential. Brose criticizes the U.S. for often limiting the military capabilities of its allies. He thinks we need to work together more effectively.
The recent attempt to retire the USS Harry S. Truman aircraft carrier, which ultimately failed, is a perfect example of how hard it is to change things in the military. There's so much political and bureaucratic resistance to anything that challenges the status quo or those big established programs.
Brose points to a whole bunch of systemic problems within the defense bureaucracy that are holding us back. You've got a culture that hates risk, people constantly moving between jobs, no real rewards for innovation, an organizational structure that's built around individual services and platforms instead of integrated kill chains, senior leaders who are always putting out fires, and the huge influence of the defense lobby in this very consolidated industry. He also mentions Admiral Khan's warnings about the damage caused by continuing budget resolutions. It's a mess.
But it's not all bad news. Brose highlights a few examples of successful change. The Air Force's decision to get rid of the J-STARS surveillance aircraft is one. They had a clear political strategy, and they worked well with stakeholders to make it happen. And then there's the Army's Night Court, where they specifically focus on finding and cutting outdated programs. So there are some bright spots.
And Brose offers some concrete steps for the future. He says it's crucial to get Pentagon leaders and Congress on the same page, working together. He's a big advocate for regular, real-world competitions that are open to everyone, not just the usual defense contractors, but also tech companies and research labs. The goal is to find the best solutions to critical military problems, and then the winners get scaled-up funding. It's about putting money where it matters.
He also suggests using the natural rivalries within the military to our advantage. We can use these competitions to push everyone to be better, and it's important to demonstrate new technologies in real-world conditions so people can see how they actually work. Finally, he argues that we need to make some big strategic bets on emerging technologies, just like we did during the early Cold War. It's about being bold and investing in the future.
So to sum up our deep dive into the kill chain, the main challenge is figuring out how to adapt American national defense for a world where we can't just assume we'll always be the dominant military power. We have the resources, the technology, the people, but the biggest obstacles are institutional and cultural. It's about changing how we think and how we do things.
And this brings us to a really important point for you, the listener. If the U.S. doesn't change, if it doesn't adapt, a revolution in military affairs will still happen. But it'll benefit someone else, not us. And that could mean losing control of our own future security and influence. We need to act now, not wait for a crisis to force our hand.
Think about the implications of all this. How can we create a more innovative, agile, and adaptive defense ecosystem? We encourage you to keep exploring these crucial questions. Join us next time for another deep dive.